Do you own rural property? Have you had dreams of working a homestead free of the congestion of the modern world? What would happen if you bought real property and were then told when you paid your property taxes that you can't do anything with that land? That while you own it, the state forces it into a state of perpetual conservation? Impossible? Well, stay to the end to see how this canary in the coal mine is coming to a state near you. See how fellow Vermonters have risen up to challenge the government. To understand what has happened, one must first examine the 6 legislative acts passed by the Vermont legislature to restrict the property rights of landowners, and how these restrictions affect rural folks. Tina Cook assembled an intuitive flowchart outlining these restrictions. The ulterior goal of these acts was crafted and advanced by an insular group of organizations and individuals who stand to benefit from these policies, or naively believe in its purpose. A lack of genuine citizen participation and low voter turnout resulted in the quiet but consistent implementation of these policies. It was a divide-and-conquer strategy to remove the governance of each small township and its select board and replace it by a bureaucratic centralized decision-making process in Montpelier by unelected government technocrats serving on various boards. Let's have a gander of Tina's flowchart and examine the various pieces. Act 250 was passed about 50 years ago as a method to control and guide growth while preserving the beauty of native Vermont. While not perfect, it did achieve some notable success in preserving the Norman Rockwell atmosphere of Vermont. With me is Sherman Bogie, whose family farm has been one of the most photographed scenes in the Vermont countryside. A major aspect of our lives is sugaring for maple syrup, so taking care of the sugar bush has been and will always be critical to many living in rural Vermont. Act 59 was quietly passed a couple of years back and mandates both the 30-30 rule as well as the 50-50 rule. It requires that the state of Vermont place 30% of its landmass into conservation by the year 2030, and as much as 50% of the land mass into conservation by the year 2050. Currently, those land holdings covered by current use are not included in these calculations. Keep in mind that current use has 2 primary versions, those being forestry exemptions and agricultural exemptions. Here is where the wicket gets sticky. Vermont is a small state, with a small population, and a colorful history that encapsulates the American Revolution with the antics of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. Its geography is one of hills and valleys, so the population settled in a significant number of small townships based on localized industries, such as stone quarrying and lumber. Much of Vermont had its forests clear-cut to create pasture and agricultural fields to support the immigrant farmers who settled the Green Mountain State. Each township was locally governed by select boards, which remain to this day. Over time, much of Vermont returned naturally to forested lands. Today, there are only a few places which we jokingly refer to as the metros. Here one finds the population centers, which include towns such as Brattleboro, Burlington, Rutland, and Montpelier. While these towns hold the highest population density of the approximately 640,000 citizens, the majority of folks still reside in these tiny villages. Some have as few as 80 residents. So for Act 59 to work, it should be clear that the government must herd the rural residents out of the country and pack them into known high-density towns, or, as the government refers to them, sustainable, walkable towns. So Act 59 presents itself as the enforcement arm for legislation yet to come under the guise of biodiversity and natural conservation. But the plan was unworkable, as the parts were disjoint. There had to be tie-in clauses to allow Act 59 enforcement of greater goals using Act 250. Under Act 250, rural residential development was often left alone, or administered by regional planning done by the various select boards. It was a project-based system, which needed to be replaced by a location-based system administered centrally in Montpelier. Simply put, Montpelier decided without citizen consent to determine how and where Vermont will grow, and where and how its population will live. So the needed missing fundamentals of the Grand Plan appeared quietly in 2024 with Act 181. It was silently passed with no genuine citizen engagement by the legislature and promptly vetoed by Governor Scott. But a supermajority, headed up by Amy Sheldon and Jill Krowinski, overrode the governor's veto. The remaining 3 items pertain to rules for wetlands and riparian rules, regional planning boards, and lastly, the current use program. While on the surface, these programs sound like good ideas, but in detail, there are also issues with them. For example, my landholding has 3 distinct types of soil, all related to glacial action millions of years ago. So while common sense mandates that one not develop improvements within riparian zones, I have seen cases where, for example, a 14-acre landholding with a 2-acre riparian zone was classified entirely as riparian. Here, the landowner would need to spend a significant amount of money to obtain a reclassification or permit for that area outside of the riparian zone. Planning boards are often used by townships to manage how growth and use will evolve. I get that, but not every township has a planning board, so this is actually a hit-and-miss proposition.
And don't forget about family. Family has always been important in rural Vermont. It's not uncommon to find several generations of Vermonters living within the same community. Often, a family who has had an agricultural landholding over several generations will arrange for younger members of the family to build a home on a portion of that existing holding. Act 181, Act 250, and Act 59 will make it much harder and more expensive to leave a legacy for my family, to build homes, and to continue the farm once I am gone. I have family members raising cattle on the farm, and I depend on kids and grandkids to help with the maple syrup business, as well as the hay and potatoes business, which is needed to pay the bills and stay current on the steep taxes.
Vermont does indeed have a housing dilemma. The projected population growth has led some government officials to believe that 40,000 housing units must be built by 2030. While this figure may be over-optimistic, one can clearly envision a conflict between this goal and the goals of Act 181 and Act 59. Let's first address the population statistics. According to the 2026 Census Bureau estimates, Vermont experienced the highest per capita population decline in the United States. The narrative finds this driven by an aging population, more deaths than births, and a reduction in migration. But Vermont ranks 38th at the bottom for having a business-friendly environment that encourages growth. Its economic outlook ranks as 48th, citing excessive taxation rates and overly complex regulations. The job outlook doesn't look much better, with an inability to attract workers, along with very sluggish job growth. There are 14 counties in Vermont, and Chittenden County is the most populous. That is one reason for the significant development projects underway in this county. But these projects are located in Tier 1 zones and have received special treatment in the form of exemptions to Act 250, which other counties have not been able to obtain. Act 181 would extend special Tier 1 treatment to other development corridors, as established by the Land Use Review Board, while forcing those building primary residences in rural areas to navigate the complexities of Act 250 and Act 181 permitting. So one can see that the numbers simply don't math out. Who is paying for this new development? Many Vermonters who are in need of housing are also going to fail qualification for mortgages. These folks will be forced into renting within these development corridors. It will be the equity capital organizations that actually benefit from this development and will move rental income out of state to appease their stockholders. Housing development constitutes a much-needed infusion within the Vermont economy, and while housing is needed within reasonable numbers, the economic gains of these projects, which come at the expense of our natural resources, must be kept within the state. But at the end of the day, it must be clear that the income-to-debt ratio gap to qualify must be closed. And the only way to do this is through a localized boost to the economy. More jobs that pay better will close this gap and make inroads to solving many problems, not just the housing problems. So you see, the housing issue doesn't just mean a shortage of housing, but also a shortage of qualified buyers to obtain that housing. Business development leading to better-paying localized jobs will work toward building a larger number of qualified Vermont home buyers. As already mentioned, Vermont is the leading producer of maple syrup in the United States, producing 3.1 million gallons in year 2024. The University of Vermont has dedicated coursework and research to support this industry through their Proctor Research Facility. There are an estimated 8 million maple taps supplying the needed sap for this production. But the record remains at 3.5 million gallons produced in 1924, a production number not met since, and a production done using the older technologies of sap buckets and horse-drawn or tractor-drawn tanker sleds and wood-fired evaporators. But 18% of the roughly 3,000 maple syrup producers actually account for 80% of the production, with tap counts exceeding 5,000 taps per operation. Some producers have in excess of 100,000 taps. These are industrial-scale operations with modern equipment. 60% of those producers with 10,000 or more taps were actively planning on increasing their tap counts by up to 20% to meet the ever-increasing demand for Vermont maple syrup. 2/3 of the total crop is certified organic by such organizations as the Northeastern Organic Farming Organization. While the larger producers often bulk pack syrup from multiple sources, there are a growing number of producers who specialize in organic, single-source, single-year production. The demand for this specialty syrup has seen a marked increase both within the USA as well as within international markets. Act 59 by itself represents an existential threat to this industry by capping the number of available taps and increasing the cost and efforts of navigating both Act 250 and Act 181 permitting. Producers already face bureaucratic challenges in dealing with NOFA certification, Vermont corporate regulations, and meeting the standards for health inspection, as well as dealing with the issues of mass marketing their product. Act 59 stands to remove 50% of the gross land mass from any form of production under the guise of conservation. Many producers have resorted to leasebacks to obtain the necessary taps needed for production, as owning the actual land may not be cost-effective. So one can envision a conflict between current-use certified sugar bush versus conservation-certified, off-limits sugar bush. Clearly, the architects of Act 181 failed to engage with the maple syrup producers and understand just what it means to carry an organic certification. In order for a sugar bush to be certified organic, it often has to meet the requirements of a master plan, agreed upon and inspected by groups such as NOFA. Not only are the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides forbidden, but provisions to improve biodiversity and animal habitat must also be followed. In my own case, I have to deal with the removal of Japanese burberry, an invasive plant that inhabits a portion of a riparian drainage. My plan also includes provisions for managing pests, such as the emerald ash borer, and the planting of non-maple species to support wildlife and improve biodiversity. It is also important to manage the accumulation of ground-based fuels from wind damage and fall downs, which limits the impact of potential forest fires. So it should be obvious that current use plans actually conserve rural areas in a way that no government-sponsored program could even reasonably approach. But in listening to a number of folks, including both government officials as well as private folks engaged in the agricultural sectors, there seems to be some level of confusion whether traditional farming is exempt from Act 250 oversight. Prior to Act 181, traditional farming activities have been exempt unless it involves construction at elevations above 2,500 feet. But remember that to be classified as a farm, the operation must be regulated by the Agency of Agriculture, Food, and Markets under the required agricultural practices. But farming in Vermont has its own unique difficulties, and farming operations have sought multiple cash streams as a means of survival. So in 2018, Vermont passed Act 143, which attempted to simplify the complexities of multiple cash stream agriculture by defining AOFBs, or accessory on-farm businesses. In general, 50% or more of the gross sales of an AOFB must be generated from the sale of products grown or produced on the farm. The AOFB must also abide by the various zoning regulations in any district regarding setbacks, etc. But there appears to be some confusion and issues regarding intersections between Act 250 and Act 143. So Act 181 actually does contain modifications to Act 143 as it relates to AOFBs, including changes to AOFB definitions, as well as some exemptions from Act 250. So an AOFB is no longer bound by the 50% rule limiting sales to on-farm produced products. An AOFB can also sell a variety of merchandise that promotes the farm or its farming practices, known as merch. Lastly, the AOFB can sell products produced from raw materials not necessarily obtained from the farm. Also note that AOFB revenues can exceed the original farm revenues. So these are actually welcome changes to the original Act 143. Act 181 also provides AOFBs with a couple of notable exceptions. The construction of storage facilities or sales facilities for qualifying products now has an Act 250 exception. So building a hay barn to protect hay for sale no longer requires an Act 250 permit. Also exempted now is the construction of processing improvements for qualifying products, so long as more than 50% of total sales of the prepared product is produced on the farm. In my case, this would include a new sugar house to process sap obtained from my sugar bush, so long as the total amount of syrup produced is obtained from my own sap production. However, should I purchase raw sap or RO concentrated sap in excess of the amount my own sugar bush yields, I would likely trigger Act 250, Act 181. Lastly, the construction of improvements relating to hosting events or dude ranching is not exempt from Act 250 oversight. According to Alex Weinhagen, public discontent with wedding venues sponsored by farming agritourism led to many complaints. So agritourism in general was omitted from the cornucopia of approved farm products. Alex Weinhagen was appointed to the Land Use Review Board by Governor Scott. A typical utility structure, not immediately used for farm product production, would be a machine shed. I have seen many machine sheds on various farms that are used to repair, protect, and modify farm-related equipment. These farm-based machine sheds were equipped with welding equipment, metal lathes, and other items used to rebuild, repair, and modify equipment. Farmers, being innovative, have often done work for others for secondary cash flow. How are these machine sheds classified in terms of whether or not an Act 250 trigger exists? Vermont has a heritage of hippies coming to Vermont to live a natural, organic existence. From this movement, we got Ben & Jerry of ice cream fame. But most importantly, this movement has evolved into the homesteading movement across the country. Modern homesteading often encompasses many aspects of operating the homestead, which includes activities outside the realm of traditional farming to support traditional farming. So there are many aspects of Act 181 that are actually positive. Alex Weinhagen further gave me assurances that land placed into conservation would still be available for maple tapping, but no specific details exist yet. But a major downside to Act 181's Tier 3 definition had an inclusion for land having a height of 1,200 feet, which is significantly lower than the original 2,500 feet cutoff under Act 250. So I certainly do not support the Tier 3 definitions, or any other attempts to limit land use at that height. Vermont's history also includes the development of machine tool technology, and was the headwaters of the Precision Valley, which cuts through Windsor and winds down through Bridgeport. Today, the American Precision Museum inhabits the old Lawrence and Robbins Armory building in Windsor. In a previous life, I was both an engineer as well as a machinist. I also participated in the restoration of many vintage machine tools, which then became useful for other work. They have found utility within the machine shed for repairing, building, or modifying equipment for the homestead. I have used them to build prototype syrup equipment, which I hope to patent. But they also generate the occasional job shop cash flow. Where Act 250 and Act 181 are seriously flawed is that their rigid structure has no provision for a sideline or side hustle within the farm business. We all know that farming is hard, time-consuming work, but not all of the time spent is directly associated with farming. There needs to be some provision within the farm definitions to allow for small, home-based businesses that do not violate the spirit of Act 250. This would include a small wood shop or metal shop within a structure that presents itself as a barn or machine shed that doesn't distract from the romance of a Vermont farm, as seen by, say, a tourist. The evolution and implementation of Act 181 and Act 59 clearly cold-cocked a significant portion of the Vermont population, and has launched a revolt against this legislation. We have seen the creation of new groups, such as Vermont Rising, whose membership has ballooned. But let this be a lesson to both the people of Vermont, as well as a lesson to our government. A government who has forgotten who they actually work for. Act 181 didn't just appear out of the ether. There were several working committees which allegedly sought input from the stakeholders to this problem. Present were the usual suspects, including equity capital concerns and large project developers who work within the Tier 1 areas. Absent from these groups were the various concerns representing rural property holders, farming organizations, Native American concerns, and, of course, the various marketing concerns representing the maple syrup industry. Also absent was representation by NOFA, or the Northeastern Organic Farming Organization. An old country saying I learned on the farm as a kid was, "If the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, then every problem presents itself as a nail." A basic review of Amy Sheldon's resume clearly shows that she has worked the environmental side. So the architects of Act 181 and Act 59 were influenced by those who would benefit from such an act at the expense of all others who weren't present. Not present in the working committees, and not present in the original draft, and not present when we allowed a supermajority to railroad this legislation into law. The 30-30 rule, for example, is not unique to Vermont. Currently, there are similar attempts at the 30-30 rule in both California as well as Maryland. Behind me is the new battleground for the people by the people. The lessons learned have been noted. Realize that this isn't a party affiliation issue, but rather a survival issue for our wonderful state of Vermont. The 30-30 and 50-50 framework is not unique to Vermont. It was put forward by the United Nations with input from groups such as the World Economic Forum. The pseudoscience and tier maps were put forth by the Nature Conservancy. And who could forget the support and lobbying efforts by the Conservation Law Foundation and, of course, the Sierra Club. But these days, you can't go anywhere without some form of international consulting firm having an opinion. The firm Future IQ provided the statewide mapping technology. And the queen bee knitting this convoluted program into a unified bill was none other than Amy Sheldon. Obviously, we Vermonters want to keep our state in as pristine a condition as we can. But Act 181 and Act 59 are certainly not the way to do it. We also have a tradition of seeking guidance from town meetings and other sources that keep a direct pulse on the population's views. Right now, we also face the travesty of stifling property taxation, with our taxes raising by more than 40% in less than 5 years. The education portion has risen 14% in 2024 alone, with a projected increase of 12%. This on top of a declining student population having ever-decreasing performance scores. It's an unsustainable trajectory. The time has come for a come-to-Jesus meeting. Limited progress on repealing or delaying the road rule, as well as the Tier 3 definitions, is only a start. But there are already carve-outs shaping up to get around some of the Tier 3 issues by moving them under different terms to Tier 2 areas. We truly need to fully repeal the entirety of Act 181 and Act 59 to avoid the convoluted issues that they will bring. The government must learn a brutal lesson in that these holdings are not theirs to play with or administer. For many, it is their only true wealth after a lifetime of hard work. I took the time to read a draft letter by my select board of Topsom, where the consensus was that they oppose portions of Act 181, but made it clear that its citizens stand ready and willing to assist the legislature. I am in full agreement here, and stand ready to assist in any way I can. I also attended a meeting by the group Vermont Stands Up, where the guest was Alex Weinhagen. The major takeaway here was that the mapping efforts for Tier 3 were seriously flawed on multiple counts. Further research on my part actually found some redeeming features of Act 181. But the road rule and the Tier 3 definitions have to go, in exchange for a more workable compromise with those stakeholders who actually represent rural Vermont on a day-to-day basis. Even if we succeed in repealing Act 181, we still have the major issues of Act 250 as it affects or punishes the less affluent Vermonter. Rest assured that there are other negative aspects to Act 181 which have yet to be uncovered publicly. And here is where the rural Vermonter can make positive change through involvement in the process. Vermont strong. Vermont rising. I would like to thank everyone who has gotten involved in these issues. A special thanks to all of the various select boards who have written letters of protest to the legislature in Montpelier. Certainly, I am proud of all the Vermonters who have joined together to voice their opinions. And a special thanks to Vermont Rising and those who have worked so diligently in getting it off the ground. Vermont is not only a wonderful state, but it's also our home. Now is the time for us to take back our government and make Vermont strong in our image.